Hello, greetings from the ancestral land of the Nooksack people, what is now Northwest Washington State. I'm Bill Pinar. I'm honored to host this launch of Peter Grimmett's important new book. A word about format. Peter will speak approximately 10 or 15 minutes about the book, and then engage each of the panelists in a conversation, Heesoon Bai, Reid, and Teresa Strong-Wilson. And we should finish that in about 45 minutes, leaving time for a question or a comment from those of you in attendance. Peter.
Yes, thank you, Bill.
It's all yours.
Let me first thank you, Bill, and Teresa and Heesoon when she arrives, and Joanne, for generously giving of your time to read the manuscript, first of all, and then pose the searching questions. Without them, this event could not have taken place. So this book represents the culmination of my research interests, framed around curriculum and teacher education over a long career, which began back in 1967. In my early work, I studied how teachers are affected by processes like reflection and action research, and by the socio-cultural political contexts in which they do their work. So my 1992 conceptualization of teachers' craft knowledge around the purposes, understandings, sentiments, and voice that teachers use to structure their work conditions and institutional contexts to facilitate meaningful study, both for their students and for themselves, was possibly my major contribution in those days. There was another contribution in 1996. There was my reconceptualization of teacher supervision. I suggested that the term had outlived its usefulness, and concluded that teachers develop pedagogically when supervision becomes transformed into a form of inquiry-oriented research that sustains a rich conversation about pedagogical choices in classroom practice. And for 5 years, I worked on a pan-Canadian study looking at the impact of recent policy changes across Canada on work conditions and teachers' conceptions of student progress. In finding teacher disenchantment with the policy changes, I raised the concern that a more ossified, government-oriented form of professionalism was being created, and that questions were emerging about whether the professional discourse of curriculum and pedagogy would remain untouched by the political, or whether the political would eventually colonize the professional. This led me to examine the policy context that increasingly influences our work in curriculum and teacher education. I examined the teacher education processes, accreditation processes in Ontario, and later questioned the extent to which, in a neoliberalist macro-political context, regulation or self-regulation protects the public interest or represents bureaucratic expansionism of governmentality. I began to explore how teacher educators lead pre-service teachers to understand subject matter content pedagogically in a manner that helps them appropriate the conditions needed to encourage study. How they prepare students for instructional preparation without resorting to technicist curriculum design approaches. How pre-service teachers construct their understanding of subject matter, pedagogy, and how program decisions are taken in an era of professional regulation that mandates accountability according to standards emerging from neoliberalism. These issues led me to investigate how the policy context was constraining practice in teaching and teacher education. I began to study then the role of faculties of education in the education of teachers, how the autonomy of university activity may be potentially jeopardized by external political forces, and the extent to which professional preparation makes a difference in how teachers teach. I examined questions of how do teacher educators' conceptions of curriculum affect the preparation process? What kinds of understanding of curriculum do pre-service teachers bring with them as a result of acquiring their academic content in non-education faculties prior to professional preparation? And how does neoliberalism, with its emphasis on professional accountability, influence the governance of teacher education? Studying teacher educators' conceptions of curriculum and the conceptions that pre-service teachers bring with them into the preparation process enabled me to ascertain the extent to which teacher education in its current form and time frame faces a Sisyphean task. Studying how professional governance constrains practice enabled me to theorize on the future of a professional process that both is problematic in impacting teachers' practice and also having its autonomy as a university activity challenged. So I became very concerned about how teachers and teacher educators seem to accept the neoliberalist discourse as if it were non-negotiable, thereby freeing it to cannibalize other discourses in its wake. I began to investigate how one can transform the policy context so that the focus again becomes one of professionality and not governmentality of public interest, and not governmentality, of whether it's of public interest and not economic rationalism and academic capitalism that make universities so susceptible to academic drift. I came to the realization that teacher education has lost its way, that its soul has been stalked by neoliberalist policy, its passion ambushed by instrumentalist curriculum that is devoid of any sense of mystery, and its educational purpose has been assailed by exogenous deprofessionalizing forces, imperious policymaking that is stifling the breath out of teaching and teacher education, creating a performativity situation in which its pedagogy is paralyzed, and as Stephen Ball has suggested, its soul is terrorized. Put differently, the orientation toward life as a teacher seems to be soulless, lacking in attention to that part of a human that makes meaning, that deepens events into experience, that is communicated through love and derives a special relationship with death to breathe life into being by invoking the imaginable possibility that engages reflection, mystery, and wonder as it interprets reality as ultimately symbolic. This lack is much deeper than our problems with mechanistic and instrumental approaches to instruction, resulting in teachers and teacher educators experiencing the shriveling of their pedagogical lives, almost as if they are like wanderers lost in a desert, thirsty for water, but uncertain where to find it, while being beguiled by multiple pipe dreams promising fulfillment. It's similar to the portrayal of T.S. Eliot's poem, The Hollow Men. Their voices have become arid, quiescent, and empty, displaying possibility but no substance, searching for hope but not inspiring, and gesticulating about pedagogy, but not making any headway. So in this book, I begin to examine how teacher education has become so infiltrated and distilled by a policy framework which preoccupies itself with costs associated with teaching, but does not know its value, that I contend unnerves teachers and disparages their practice. Educators are not so much expected to impart breakthrough knowledge using creative pedagogy as they are to ensure that policy is followed in the forms of increasing student success on standardized tests. They're no longer accountable to their profession and to their students in regard of their subject matter and instructional mastery. Rather, they're subject to performativity measures put in place by policymakers that quantify their productivity and assess their professional worth. So I argue that teaching has become a mundane, almost perfunctory endeavor to match external expectations, which is in grave danger of losing its enticement, leaving teachers with reduced motivation and unhinged purpose. I claim that some new spark is needed, something that brings about a re-enchantment of teacher education. And in this book, I attempt to offer a re-enchantment that is steeped in an understanding that wisdom, profound insight, and savoir-faire require an honest appreciation of mystery. An enchanted world of mystery speaks to the soul of educators, to the arcane depths of the heart and imagination, where we find value, meaning, and oneness with the world around us, such that we can gain a sense of fulfillment that makes life purposeful and full of passion. Such re-enchantment would inevitably stand the dominant neoliberal audit culture values on their head, enabling teachers and teacher educators to connect vitally with the world they inhabit. While it may not prevent teachers fully from occasionally becoming dysfunctional professionals, something we all encounter sometimes, it would nevertheless arrest the iniquitous neoliberalist trend toward making teachers well-adjusted policy robots. For they would begin to appreciate wonder, mystery, and story, together with a respect for other cultures and life's simplicities, rather than being neurotically driven to hyperactivity by an imagistic world's heavy emphasis on performativity and self-aggrandizement. My intent, then, is not so much to debate the agendas of teacher education as to revivify its currently tormented pedagogical soul. The book proposes a re-enchantment in the form of a disabuse of instrumentalist curriculum that would give educators a renewed engagement with pedagogical life, permitting them to relocate their fondness, attachment, and devotion to the vision and purpose that first brought them into teaching. Such re-enchantment is framed around educators responsibly infusing the work of teaching with value, meaning, passion, and purpose, making the work of teachers not just successful, but more importantly, significant in the lives and learning of their students. It focuses, therefore, on the missing mystique in the education of teachers. The purpose of this is to bring about a re-enchantment of the practice of teaching through a remystification of teacher education by reclaiming appropriate but missing myths and dismissing inappropriate and indecorous ones, by regenerating a sense of wonder and the marvelous in the world through the care of the self and self-formation, enabling them to find the source of pedagogical inventiveness within, such that they foster a soulful response to external pressure. And by rehabilitating mystery and edifying epiphanies as central to living their lives as teachers, they become pedagogically wide awake, experiencing increased present and abandon in the moment with students, together with a heightened sense of ethicality, intellectual poise, and inner serenity. That is my hope, and that is my aim with this book.
Thank you so much, Peter.
Yeah.
Heesoon, would you like to go first?
Yes. Well, yes, of course.
Oh, Heesoon, good to see you.
Oh, good to see you, Peter. Wow. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to participate and have a conversation with you and our colleagues here. Your book was totally enchanting. I only gave a first read through, but it's going to be read again and again. It's so much there, and I really thank you for writing this very important book, and I hope it'll be a guide for all of us. And I consider educators to be all of us, not just in K-12 or higher education. I think every human being, when they come to their senses, would realize that they are educators. So I think your book should have a very, very wide audience. Any case, well, where I wanted to go, well, first of all, when I was preparing for this conversation, I thought I should read your book from the soulfulness and see what calls me forth right away. Everything, of course, you know, my intellect, those part of me, philosophically trained and all that, had a lot of reception to your work. But nonetheless, the two passages that I chose here, I think there is a Professor Pinar's instruction. I have them here now. Am I to share my screen or?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Now, am I given the? Sorry for wasting time.
I made you a co-host. I think. I think you're a co-host, so you can.
So okay, let's see if I can do this. Screen share. Okay. Yeah, sorry, I was a couple minutes late in showing up.
I had the audacity to suggest you were on SFU time, Heesoon.
Sorry. Okay, well, I'm sure this is more my technology.
It's not necessary. It's not necessary, so just
okay,
no,
I'll just
it's not necessary.
Okay. All right, I'll just read then. So two passages, one from page 192 and the other one page 193, and I'll just be quick in reading it out. Soulfulness, by the way, I really appreciate a soulfulness. I mean, you know, a soul seems to have a bit of a substance issue, and I thought some people might wonder, you know, or they would say they don't have a soul, they don't believe in such a thing. But soulfulness is, I think people can identify that much more readily. But anyway, so here it goes. Soulfulness entails searching one's cared for self and fully formed subjectivity for the main manifestation of purpose in terms of how one uses one's personal power in line with the vision of a greater good to and for humanity. And Peter, and side remark, I'll say that's what you're doing with your book. You're manifesting your soulfulness in this manner. Such searching implies that taking time to reflect is just as important as all the time it takes to be busy as a teacher. Couldn't agree more. It means becoming quiet, to be at peace with whatever action we have to take. It means refusing to be running around indiscriminately as if we are a motor idling, all fired up, but essentially going nowhere. Yes, I catch myself in those moments all the time. That's me. When we sense we are going nowhere fast, it is important to turn off the engine, as it were, save our energy, and discard the noise. By the way, that's very difficult to do. Because it is often in these moments of quiet and peaceful relaxation, that a solution to what troubles and perplexes us may just be revealed. And we experience the ancient prophets promised that, quote, in quietness and in confidence shall be your strength, Isaiah 30 and ... Thus, a soulful response entails a quiet struggle to hear one's inner voice and to act upon it with courage, strength, and conviction. So that passage really resonated with me. And this is also, I could say, this is what, well, I won't say a prescription so much as some direction, how we can find the soulfulness within us and the challenges we encounter in trying to do that too. And then the next passage is from next page, 193. The ego represents our persona, the self, sometimes false, sometimes a caricature, sometimes marginally accurate, that we project to others. Again, my remark, I think that's so accurate, psychologically speaking. In portraying our persona, we think of ourselves solely as cognitive and corporeal beings disconnected from our existential subjectivity or our true self. The ego often expresses dissatisfaction and a sense of inadequacy while constantly seeking gratification elsewhere, evincing the phenomenon of the grass always being greener on the other side of the fence. That is, the ego rarely lives in the now, but is always using the current moment as a means to the next, reacting to each moment from a state of deficiency and privation. By contrast, the soul is our inmost being, our subjective consciousness itself that does not seek escape from the now, but is present in each experience with a possible accompaniment of wisdom, compassion, integrity, joy, creativity, and peace. The soul does not therefore react from a state of deficiency and privation. Rather, it responds in each moment from a state of previous fulfillment and actualization. So those are the two passages. And again, I think I really resonate just because I think, having lived so many decades, I just recognize all this happening in me and in others. And I chose these two and put them side by side. And the question I would like to ask is, what would be the connection between the soul, the center of the soulfulness, say, and the ego? Because to me, there's a vital connection. And understanding the connection will be very helpful for us in search of soulfulness, and most importantly in the search to deal with the ego, because it's just ego is running rampant, just rampant, I would say. So we have to do something with the ego that's running the show. I don't want to say especially in the academy, because how do I know about the rest of the world? But the academy seems to be quite ego-driven. Anyway, so there we go.
Thanks, Heesoon. Well, the academy is set up to nurture people's egos, because we really only advance our careers by shameless self-promotion, which is a phrase which we both have heard from a colleague of ours at SFU. And I just want to say, because it's something which just struck me when you read that passage, I remember when it first hit me that people actually don't listen to others often in conversation. They're always thinking about how they will react to the next moment, and they're thinking of what they should say rather than actually listening to what is being said. And as a consequence, many people in conversation talk past one another, which is actually a concept which first was introduced to me in German literature by Max Frisch and Friedrich Dürrenmatt. but I was too young at that point to understand what they were getting at. But the tendency of people to speak across people rather than to them, because you're always thinking of how your own ego can benefit next. And so your question, which you put to me, was, can a soul be hurt and damaged? And is an ego a hurt soul? I think it's a very interesting and provocative question, and it's particularly provocative within the academy, because you only have to be in the academy to come across lots of egos, and many of those are hurt. In my view, the human soul as a source of energy field can be diminished and shriveled, but not hurt, because it has neither fears nor needs. By contrast, the ego can often suffer hurt when its fears are exacerbated and its needs not met, particularly in a world that through technological advancement has become so imagistic. A hurt ego conceals, suppresses, and occludes the soul, which I'm talking about as being the center of our being, what Heidegger calls das Dasein. When the ego or the persona is hurt, it takes center stage, and the soul or the inner person retreats behind a veil. As humans, we often don't reveal our true person that readily. And when we do, it's always to people we can trust. That is, when our ego's fears about survival, safety, and security are assuaged and unshackled, we can then attentively and ingenuously enter into a communal connection or an interrelationship with other magnanimous and beneficent souls. Put differently, when we realize who we are, the veil over the soul is lifted and the ego recedes. When facing a hurt ego, particularly in the academy, soothing and comforting actions may lessen the intensity of the ego's needs and its overweening view of itself in a burdensome context. But such action could also reinforce the ego's harsh demands. What we have to do when we're dealing with people in this situation is to lift the veil to the soul so that the ego can recede. So how do we lift the veil? In my role of academic leadership in 2 universities, I've come across this quandary of dealing with hurt egos many, many times. It's too soon for me to use live examples of what I have experienced, so I have to talk abstractly. Lifting the veil is similar to another description I've used earlier in the book, raising the water level, which applies when the flow of action is jammed. Raising the water level is something I have actually done, entailed developing strategic activities that would bring different and sometimes very obdurate colleagues together in activities that gave some degree of success, such that they became open then to further suggestions about possible academic direction, meaning that we could have a conversation about possibilities when previously there was so much at loggerheads that discussing a matter was very next to impossible without getting into the tension that the hurt egos created. lifting the veil is similar but different. It would involve me in having to stop and listen calmly to my inner self and encourage and enable others to do likewise. I did have a moment like this in the last 10 years with someone who was quite distraught and had difficulty. And I had to calm myself down and then calm the other person down so that we could lift the veil, so that the real issues and the real person and the real discomfort could be actually exposed. And this is what was meant by the suggestion that I made on page 197 in the book, that we slow down by ignoring our ego's reaction to the external events. And in the example that I'm thinking of, I'm trying to be very careful because I can't give too much away, but I became a venom collector. I collected the venom because that's all that the ego of the person I was dealing with could express. But the purpose was not to make myself a sacrifice. It was so that we could actually get to the point of getting beyond the ego that was spewing out these awful sentiments. And so we need to ignore our ego's reaction to the external events so that we can listen to the murmurs of our own heart, so that we can show that what we have become, not our cherished projected image, but a lightness of spirit that is fully engaged in life with all its vicissitudes. And when we're dealing with people whose egos are hurt, we cannot get caught up in their hurt or with the venom that is expressed as a result of that hurt. So we have to somehow soften our reaction to the events so that we can actually think calmly about how to proceed. That's what I'm calling lifting the veil or lifting the focus away from the ego hurt so that the real person that is underneath that ego can emerge with the real very deep difficulties that is creating some of the problematic features. And it's a bit like Sarah's, who I've cited on page 249. We have to ignore the noises of conflicts, carnage, and jealousies emitted by inexhaustible chatterboxes that prevent us from hearing, in this instance, the non-instrumentalist song of curriculum that restores life and joy. And I'd have to say that in the current context of the news, there are times when I have to ignore the noise of the inexhaustible chatterboxes because it's actually unsettling and distressing rather than communicating factual information about what is actually happening, which is what news is supposed to be about. So let me add one other thing.
All right.
Over the last 2 years, the pandemic has exacerbated the ego's needs for survival, safety, and security. And political leadership has exploited the crisis situation to gain power through divisive tactics. And I want to mention here a book I've recently finished reading by Niall Ferguson, one of the world's most renowned historians. It's called The Politics of Catastrophe. And his thesis is that these crises are made worse by political short-sightedness around the strategic gain of power. So coming back to lifting the veil and the way in which our needs have been exacerbated through the pandemic and the isolation that it has caused, it's almost been like we've been incarcerated within Zoom and we can't meet face to face. And my wife's health condition throughout the pandemic brought to the fore for me a struggle between my ego and my soul. It took me quite a time of struggle to realize there can be no conflict. The conflict being that I would often wish I had more time to write, or I would wish that I could get on with doing this or doing that, instead of facing up to the now and the circumstances of the now, which always had to take precedence. But even though I resolved it, the point I want to make is I have had to continuously resolve that there is no contest. That is in the specifics of my own situation. The ego desperately wants to veil the soul. The struggle is ever present. And hypocrisy emerges when we pretend that that contest is over, that the ego is controlled, because it isn't. It only happens as we lift the veil. We must let go of our ego need to control situations for our own survival, safety, and security in order that we find inner peace, playfulness, life, and joy in whatever challenge we face. And this goes back to the problems within academia and dealing with hurt egos. We cannot cure the ego problems of others, only our own, which we do by lifting the veil that shrouds the soul. And in likewise, we encourage others to follow suit. Whether they do or not is their choice. But the soul is a marvelous thing. And one of the exciting parts about this correspondence is a poem that Timothy Findlay sent to Bill Pinar. And I want to read it here about the soul. If I can just find it in my pieces of paper. Here it is. Soul by Timothy Leonard. Soul drives the movements that mark our lives, anchors our bodies in time and space, awakens us to the world and people, wakeful for faces and laughter and song. Soul holds us tight when we need to feel safe, opens us to welcome the terrors of darkness, the ache of growth, the pain of loss, the fear of the rawness of life. Soul then issues the command to obey the harsh claims the world makes upon us, to take our place within its wildness, to act with courage for love, for justice, to seek a world home that is sane and whole, with enough bread, enough work, enough warmth for all.
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah.
Thank you, Heesoon. Joanne, will you proceed?
I will, and thank you, Heesoon, for that lovely question, and Peter for your response. I'm going to change tack and be much more practical, I'm sorry. Yeah. And share my screen there. Can people see that?
Uh-huh.
Great. I'm coming and speaking to you this morning and greetings from Wiradjuri country in Western New South Wales in Australia. And I'm very pleased to be part of this conversation, because back in 2017, my friends Bill Green, Mari Brennan and I wrote about what we saw as the struggle for the soul of teacher education. We argued that teacher education is struggling to thrive as an intellectual and practical endeavour when the policy context renders it instrumental. Our argument there was that a reconceptualised view of professional practice was what was needed for regenerating teacher education. Peter begins his book with the claim that we didn't go nearly far enough, and that in fact we ended with a whimper, just simply exhorting the field to exert itself rather than developing any sort of manifesto for inspirational practice. He has done this. Peter, you've done this here. You have done this work. You've argued explicitly for restoring soul, passion and purpose in teacher ed as a means of contesting the instrumentalized curriculum and pedagogy. And so when I got the invitation to read and respond here today, I saw myself as the ideal reader for this book. I began teaching a little later than Peter. Mine was in the mid-70s, after a one-year grad dip ed that inspired in me the passion and belief in resisting all forms of oppression and social inequality. I stood as a young teacher on the moral high ground, happily radical, even more happily ignorant of my own shortcomings, and probably pretty soulless. But I taught English. I could think I could change the world. And although, Peter, I've never worked with you closely, I really feel, having read the book, that I know you so well now as a teacher, and I know how much alike we are in our passion for teacher education and long sentences. Scrolling through my yellow post-it notes on the manuscript, for instance, I found the other day that on page 100, where Peter was writing about the craft knowledge you talked about earlier, and the power of story for teaching, I have written, but this is curriculum programming. This is my PhD, isn't it? This, this work of imagining a narrative that will play out and unfold with your students. The connections here with Garth Boomer was very clear for me, the connections with Kieran Egan's work, all the things that was part of what made me important to me as a teacher. What a pleasure, I wrote, to be engaging with this text. It's killing me softly. It's telling my life. And at this point, I started to worry, because, Peter, I also routinely use Foucault to think with, and I started to think that although my pleasure in this book is not a bad thing at all, it might be dangerous. My task that Bill asked us to do was to choose a question to put to Peter as we send this work out into the world today. And so I made myself calm down. If this is the book I would have liked to have written, and I would have loved to have written this book, Peter, but are there any deep crises of the soul of teacher ed that I have still not yet come to terms with, and that are not fully resolved yet in my reading here? What I need to move on to the next slide, because this is my piece. What I really need to ask Peter about is one of the critical points of contention and ambiguity that I have never resolved as a teacher educator, and that still deeply troubles my conviction that the soul of teacher education lies in its ethical responsibility to the other, to our students and to their students. At this moment here in Australia, and I'm hearing how strongly it is in Canada too, the struggle for the soul of teacher education is still paramount. We're being attacked on three fronts at the moment using pretty predictable strategies. Responsibility for the failure to outperform other countries on international tests of reading and writing is placed on the failure of teacher education to recruit, educate, and prepare a quality teaching force. 2, responsibility for remediating the inadequacies of initial teacher education is transferred to national standards authorities. We've just had last month in February, the latest review of quality of teacher education in Australia reporting, and they actually suggest that punitive measures should be taken against universities who do not conform to the national program standards. Those two strategies of attack are brought together very pointedly for me where the third barrage, I guess, is that responsibility for the very real and continuing failure of Australian schools to close the gap between the achievement of Indigenous and non-Indigenous children is placed on inadequate progressivist approaches to reading education in teacher ed. To this end, a leading and very well respected, by me at least, Indigenous Australian educator, Noel Pearson, has made strident claims in the press that teachers must be using direct instruction if they're going to turn around disadvantaged learners in schools. Policymakers here have listened, and we now have what I see as almost a perfect storm. If teacher educators, we've just been told, do not use evidence-based, phonics-based approaches to the teaching of reading in their curriculum and pedagogy, they may face the threat of losing accreditation for their programs. I am greatly troubled by this situation. I resist philosophically and morally the imposition of that sort of straitjacketed pedagogical approaches like direct instruction on the minds and souls of young children, and more importantly here on the education of young teachers. And Peter's words that I've had up there about the enchantment of teaching as reconstruction versus teaching as knowledge dissemination really strikes a chord with me. Peter asks himself, a page after the first quote there, how do teachers avoid the temptations all practitioners occasionally confront to accept low expectations, to ignore intellectual and moral concerns, and to forego the responsibilities to students that one accepts in becoming a teacher? In short, becoming an unimaginative functionary. And that's the question I've put back to Peter now, because I need to hear you engage more with the thinking in the book. Mm-hmm. How should my teacher education practice respond to Noel Pearson? Is my commitment to the moral and intellectual soul of teaching actually doing violence to the life chances of kids who do not have the luxuries and linguistic capital to learn like I do? What is our responsibility to students who are not like ourselves? Students who have to learn the language of instruction rather than having already acquired it from home, in James G's terms, and whose communities ask us explicitly to help them gain access to the non-intellectual, instrumental knowledges that they see as key to the privileges that we were born with. It's a question I've never had the answer to. And Peter, you have gone so far in the book to addressing it, and I'd love to hear you talk more. Thank you.
Okay.
I'll stop sharing.
Let me share some of my immediate responses to what you've just said. Remembering that I first met Bill, your husband, in South Africa in 2009, but I met you in 2008 in Australia. And what I hear you saying is there is a discourse that is at large in policymakers that is suggestive that anything that is progressive is not adequately educating people who are somehow less privileged than people of our generation, and particularly I think I heard in it the colonial division between more native persons and people who would be lovingly called white settlers. And I remember facing this with my own children. Because when my eldest, who's now 46, was learning English in high school, he had a very strict old-fashioned traditional English teacher. And my son balked at it a bit. And I worked with him to help him understand. And the tack I took was this. If you can be convinced that the teacher has your future, your benefit at heart, then I'm prepared to listen to any methods that they use, but I want to know that they're really wanting to educate you. So even if the method seems to be a bit archaic, what is the motivation that drives that teacher? And I further argued, I said, I've seen some progressive teachers who do things differently, but they're really all caught up in themselves. And I said, I'd far rather you have an education from someone who may, in fact, in my view, not share my curriculum and pedagogical choices, but they're prepared to have that, maybe almost use the word soulful, commitment to your benefit, and that the reason why they're teaching in this way is to benefit you, not to actually bolster their own prowess or their own image as a teacher. I said, I'd far rather have you educated by someone who has your interests very much at heart than by someone who doesn't have your interests at heart and is more progressive in their pedagogy. And he was able then to get his head down and learn. And he's been pretty successful in the sense that he's the richest person in this family. But that's really beside the point. I think we've got to be quite flexible. And this is why I'm trying to talk about soulfulness, not method. We can't be so given to a particular approach or method that becomes our ideology. Or put it differently, that becomes our image. We're working on our image as a progressive pedagogue. There are situations in which we may have to change the way we teach in order to accommodate the needs of the situation and the needs of the learners. What I'm against very strongly is policymakers telling us what those needs are. So in other words, making a dictate that progressive pedagogies are irrelevant is as bad as any progressive saying old-fashioned techniques are irrelevant. It depends on the circumstances of the situation and the needs of the learners in that situation. And so I'm quite prepared to ignore the noise of what policymakers are making because of the discourses that they are actually basing it on. It's basically a neoliberalist discourse. I'm also though, prepared not to take an ideological stand on that, because there are situations, I think, in which the needs of learners possibly do need to be adapted to. And sometimes if learners don't know the language that we in the white settler section have been born into, then there's a need for that language to be given, if that language is important to their future. What I'm arguing for is the absence of an ideological stance, because that, I think, is where the political mismanagement of every crisis we've had in humanity for a long time has come about. And so that's where I'm with Suarez. We need to ignore that external noise and actually connect with the vital nowness of the situation in which we find ourselves. And so I found myself in many instances switching in particular situations and contexts from what I would normally regard as a progressive mindset. But it's temporary as I attempt to deal with the situation at hand. And the reason why I didn't want to write about the struggle for the soul of teacher education, well, it was twofold. One is because Ken Zeitner has written that book, and that deals with all with policy. And for me, that book's been written, and also it I couldn't take the book where I wanted it to go, which is into the struggle within the mind and the soul of the educator to do what he or she thinks is best in specific circumstances for a specific set of students. And while I obviously favor more progressive pedagogies, I'm prepared to say, no, they don't necessarily apply across the board. I have to assess the situations where they apply. And so what I was trying to do was to ignore the noise that policymakers make, because I don't think that actually makes any difference at the action level. I wanted to look at how we could influence teachers and teacher educators to get to know themselves better, to know why they respond in the way that they do to situations in the classroom. Why, for instance, we respond to certain kinds of students in one way and to others in another way, when we would claim that we're trying to treat each one equally. And I believe that that begins to happen when teachers begin to understand who they as persons are themselves. And that's what I'm really referring to as soulfulness. You're actually not accepting the discourse of neoliberalism, which actually makes pronouncements about progressive pedagogy or against this or against that, but you're actually accepting that your professionality in teaching is to assess each circumstance on its merits and to adapt your pedagogy and your curriculum making to the very needs of the students in front of you. And if that's students who don't understand how to explore, then maybe you have to give them some direct instruction. But the direct instruction then becomes not the end in itself, but a means to the end of getting through to the students. And the danger is that once we get into the habit of doing one thing or another, it becomes calcified. That's what we do. And we're always committed to it. And I'm arguing for a more pragmatic approach. So I'm glad you raised that question. I didn't actually mean to undermine your contribution by calling it a whimper. I just was expecting you to outline what you were trying to get at, because it was in fact one of the premises that helped me formulate the book. And I've written it a bit like Rilke wrote a book of lessons to a young poet, and they were actually letters to himself. He was the young poet. And in one sense, this is like a letter I've written to myself as a young teacher, as a young academic, who has in many ways contributed frequently and often to the problems which I've actually outlined, and the need to not go that route, the need to understand who you are, what you're doing, and to be true to that sense of yourself, and to be true to a sense of vocation where your public service and your personal fulfillment come together. And I'm equally open to the prospect that that can come in all forms of pedagogy. What concerns me most is not which pedagogy is being used, but can someone justify the pedagogy as it meets the needs of the students in a manner that your personal fulfillment and your public service in teaching in that way makes you eminently satisfied with the choice you have made to be a teacher.
That's a brilliant response.
Right, thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
And thank you, Joanne. Teresa.
Well, it's such a pleasure to be here. And thank you, Bill, for this invitation. And when I saw the title, I knew it was something that I would want to read. And however, like the others have expressed, I didn't really know what I was in for when I started reading it. It was deep, and it was provoking, and it was refreshing. And it's even more so to hear you now speak to the book, Peter. So my preamble is quite short because I wanted to get to the question. So that I can hear you speak some more. So I'm going to ask my main question if I can. So I'll share my screen so that everybody can see what that question is. And I'll give a bit of a context for it. So I happen to be working on a book presently with some architects. And so although I noted many passages throughout your book, and they are in the subsequent slides, which I also had sent to you as questions, what really struck me and completely took me by surprise, welcome surprise, was your last chapter, your conclusion, in which you talk about your experience with your wife of visiting the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin. And here's the quote that you have in your book: "In the space between the concrete pillars, we experienced a brief encounter with sunlight, tormenting us with the possibility of a brighter life beyond the walls. How does one enact a soulful approach under such desultory conditions?" And so my question has to do with your experience of being at this Holocaust Memorial and choosing to write about this in the conclusion of your book, that along with the other events that you chose to write about there too, and that you've spoken to here as well, the struggles with your wife and her health condition. But with respect to my own interest in this, I've been writing about thinking about unsettling subjectivity, as I said, with a group of people, including architects, for this book. And I've learned an awful lot from one architect in particular, who was a co-editor, who has been in the field for a very long time. And so he's spoken about his practice of pilgrimages. And so he talks about how he goes on pilgrimages to particular places. They're not the usual places that people normally go to, the most popular places necessarily, but they're ones that are of interest to him architecturally. And he brings his students, and it becomes an occasion as well for teaching and learning. And he's talked about how the first step in any design, and he's not the only one who talks about it in this way, but it's been part of a group of people, I suppose, that he's drawn on, where he talks about going to the actual place, he said it's not the usual practice of architects nowadays. So somewhat similar to what you're talking about with instrumentality, technical approaches, bureaucratization with teacher education. So rather than using, an image of a design found on the internet or drawing maps and so on, computer maps, the approach that he as an architect has taken along with other architects is to actually visit places, to go there, to sit there, to breathe them in, to really get a sense of the place, and where it often takes, time. It doesn't take only a few hours. It takes some considerable time to go there, go back there, and so on. And where part of the pilgrimage is the actual walking there to the place. So not driving there within one's car, but taking the train and then walking the several kilometers that it takes to get to this particular place. Mm-hmm. So when I happened, as I said, happened to be having these conversations right now, at the same time as I was reading your book, reading in particular one architect who this person whose name is Ricardo Castro, who just retired from McGill, read quite a bit and deeply, and someone, Christopher Alexander, I don't know if you know that, British architect, Christopher Alexander. But he writes as well a lot about things that we do in curriculum studies, about the importance of lived experience and about the soul and so on. And so someone you might be interested to look up after. So my question is, given that kind of practice, soulful practice that I've been hearing about from this architect and listening to you speak and reading your book, to what kinds of places should teachers and teacher educators and professors conduct pilgrimages actually and or mentally to restore a sense of soul, passion, and purpose?
Well, thank you, Teresa. I like visiting places that have an impact on my own sense of self. Remember, at age 12, I visited the Belsen camp. I didn't really understand fully then, but it became more and more meaningful as I grew older. And one of the pilgrimages, which I guess I would like to make, although it's not possible at the moment, would be to see what, in fact, it's like to move from Kiev to the west of Ukraine, and the journey that many women and children have had to make in the last few days, so that I can understand the absolute inhumanity that war causes. But I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, because one of the things that you asked me about as well is what about the Berlin Holocaust Museum. I found that a very moving experience, because I had also, I remember in, I think it was 1967, I went to Nuremberg. And the whole idea was actually to watch a soccer game between Nuremberg and Bayern Munich. But going into the stadium, you went past all of the mound upon which Hitler enunciated some of his most powerful speeches. And it was a very eerie kind of sensation. to look up there and to realize that some of the things which I'd seen on film had taken place there. And the way I would use a pilgrimage to places as a form of pedagogy is a little different from the people you've referred to. I would want to use it to explain certain themes. And so, for instance, I would use these sites as potential repositories for studying themes of societal discrimination, violence, and power. And so I have mentioned Belsen, I've mentioned the Holocaust Museum. I also visited Auschwitz, which is just outside to the west of Munich. And Karl Marx had that saying, history repeats itself first as tragedy, second as farce. I would try and illustrate that by examining first the unification of the German states by Bismarck in 1867. And we could explore, this is more of an abstract pilgrimage rather than a concrete one, explore how the repeated 19th century wars between Germany and France had led to France demanding at the Treaty of Versailles confiscatory terms of surrender, which essentially meant that the greater Germany that Bismarck had founded was being split up. And the purpose for this is my underlying sense that in victory, there is a need for the victors to be gracious, when in fact, France was not being very gracious at all. They were actually being vengeful. And when Hitler came to power in 1933, his aim was to establish that re-establish that greater Germany that Bismarck had unified. And to do that, it meant taking back the Sudetenlands and Poland, parts of Poland. So tragically, history repeated itself because the French had been so vengeful. It precipitated a movement, a populist movement, as we see happening today, that really brought about Hitler rise democratically to his situation as Chancellor. And we then have Hitler's flawed attempt at a reunification that precipitated the Second World War when he moved into Poland. And if we move to the 20th and the 21st centuries, we could explore how the Russian Revolution in 1917 led to the establishment of the communist regime that expanded the borders of Russia to the Soviet Union of the satellite surrounding states. And the downfall of the Soviet Union in 1991 led to the reunification of Germany and the rise of democracy in Russia. Now, the early leader of Russia was Boris Yeltsin, but he appointed Vladimir Putin as the premier in 1999. And when Yeltsin retired of ill health in 2000, Putin became president, acting president, and anybody who's acting often becomes the real thing. And he's been in power ever since. And in 2005, Putin gave a speech claiming that the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century was the breaking apart of the Soviet Union. So recently, his aim has been to reunify under Russia the lands that became independent countries in 1991. Hence, Russia's incursion into Ukraine on February the 24th, 2022. An example of history repeating itself. Secondly, Hitler was the first, which was tragic, but this secondly as farce. Because the NATO forces and the Western world are doing whatever they can to avoid a third, possibly nuclear world war. So that would be how I would use the visitation of different themes or different incidents in history to illustrate a theme. But let me come more to your question about concrete possibilities. Within the context of the curriculum and pedagogy in teacher education, I would think of 5 possible pilgrimages. And these would probably have to be done remotely, as is what we do these days. First of all, I'd want students to be taken to the House of Commons in Ottawa to witness what happens by policymakers and politicians during question period. Secondly, I'd want them to visit a court of law in which lawyers are arguing adversarially the case for and against a murder charge. Thirdly, I would want them to visit the ruins of a residential school. There's one here in BC that I visited at Alert Bay. Fourthly, I'd want them to visit, and this would have to be remotely, but the gold-plated streets of the ancient city of Ephesus in Turkey. Again, that's one that I visited. And fifthly, I'd want them to visit an elementary classroom where I've conducted research to witness a teacher orchestrating with consummate ease different groups of learners tackling reading and calculation. Now, in each visit, I will want them to focus on what is happening, what do they observe. But then after they've captured that, I would want them to analyze what they've observed and seen happening in terms of the uses of power, whether for discrimination, for greed, for domination or colonization, or for truth, beauty, and a sense of the public good. So that we could then have a full discussion of how they, as would-be teachers, can use their professional power of curriculum and pedagogy to enhance children's life choices, and to what extent teachers should be bound by policies that have their origin in notions of powers used to discriminate and dominate societally. Now, clearly, by posing the themes, I've got some input into the architecture. But that's similar to what you suggested of Madeleine Grimmett, my etiological cousin, of furnishing other people's houses. I would obviously be furnishing some themes for them to respond to, with the point that I actually do think that power should not be misused or abused, but used for purposes of public good. But I also want to get in place there the conception that when you're a teacher, you do have power. You can't pretend that you don't. It's what you do with it that counts. And I think the purpose of working in this way is so that they begin to think through their own understanding of what they are doing when they are teaching. A lot of the politics of teachers' unions is based on adversarialism. Is that how they want to view their teaching? A lot of the gold-plated streets of Ephesus are lavish because it was possible to use resources in that kind of way. Is that something that they want to do? And you visit the ruins of the residential school, you can see that the impact and the effects of colonization and misplaced power. Even if you can make the argument that it started out with good intentions, power, in fact, changed those intentions in the concrete experience of time and of those children. And if you've ever been to Ottawa in question period, you come away shaking your head. Why would I want to have anything that's suggested by people whose egos are so big and are front and center in every discussion, influence how a teacher actually interacts with children? And so this is a different kind of pilgrimage to what you've described with your friends. And I must look up Christopher Alexander. But I find that one of the things which troubles me very much today is I don't know where the world as a community of human people wanting to connect to one another is heading. I'm trying not to get into more recent events, but we seem to be in a situation where it seems to be okay to say one thing and do something else. And I'm trying to write about the need to have that inner consistency where what you say is who you are, instead of projecting an image about yourself that you want other people to be convinced about. And so you then are caught up in doing things which are all about painting your image and convincing people of its efficacy, instead of actually getting on with living life as a person and connecting humanly with other humans in a manner that actually builds the public good. And so in that sense, that's why I wrote the book. I didn't have to write. I'm retired. But I had to write about this because this is, if you like, it's my last testament. And it's the only thing in these past 2 years that has got me intellectually excited. I find I enter sometimes into a space when I'm listening to what's happening in the world, I want to cry out, and then I check myself and say, why would I give more noise to an already situation that is saturated by noise and chatterboxes? And so I've gone the more gentle route of writing, I think, about how teachers can connect with their students in vital ways, to bring in their students a revivified life and experience of living that in the end contributes to a society that we all want to belong to.
Thank you.
That sounds like an appropriate note on which to conclude our pilgrimage today. Thanks to each of the panelists, Heesoon Bai, Joanne Reid, and Teresa Strong-Wilson. Thanks especially to our author, Peter Grimmett, and thanks to each of you who've attended. Allow me to close by joining Peter in remembering our sisters and brothers in the Ukraine.